Joining us here in Washington is Islamic scholar and Pakistan's former ambassador to the United Kingdom and Ireland, Akbar Ahmed. Among his many books is Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam. Ambassador, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Anand, for inviting me.
We just saw that report there. I will get to what Donald Trump had to say a little bit later. But first, let's talk about what Arslan Iftikhar said in that report. He's a Muslim leader. He's known nationally. And he said, sadly, I think Islamophobia has become an entrenched and accepted form of racism in America. You can always take pot shots at Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and really get away with it with impunity. Has that what it's got down to now?
I think so. I regret to say it, Anand, but if you look at the incidents that are occurring throughout the United States with, unfortunately, too great a frequency, there is that pattern. It's building up over the last couple of months. It's reaching a sort of climax, and it is correlated to what Donald Trump is saying and raising the temperature. So you can see several things coming together in this focus on Muslims. It's not new. It's been happening more or less after 9/11. It's been building up, and now the frequency increases.
Right, and when we look at this kind of racism, Islamophobia, as it's called, is it a result of extremists like Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, using Islam to perpetrate these terrorist acts?
Yes, they give a lot of ammunition because they are doing dreadful things in the name of Islam, which scholars like me will say is not Islamic at all. But Anand, we need to step back and look at American society. I spent a year in the field doing field work in the United States, looking at Muslims in America in the context of American history and society. American society has had a history of receiving new immigrants with hostility, sometimes with violence. This includes white European Christians, the Irish, and so on. Non-Christians like Jews had to face the same process. So it took these minorities a century or two before they were fully accepted and incorporated into American society. So that's also partly what you're seeing happening now, because Muslims came to the United States in large numbers in the 1960s, 1970s, after Kennedy and Johnson passed the act allowing them to come. And they came in as middle-class doctors, entrepreneurs, and they just blended in. There was no Muslim problem. It's only after 9/11 that Americans wake up and start asking the question made famous by President Bush: why do they hate us? So they look around and say, who's our neighbor? If he's a Muslim, who's my doctor? If he's a Muslim, who's my professor? If he's a Muslim, who is he? What's the background? Where do they come from? What do I know about Islam? And all that feeds into what we are now calling Islam.
Then, before people who follow the Muslim faith are fully accepted into American society?
I'm afraid it will be, and it will be a bumpy road, because it will involve not only Muslims, and Muslims are far from united, they're far from organized, they're not really responding in terms of the crisis around them. There's fear, there's panic, but there needs to be much more clarity in terms of where they stand, in terms of what we call reform, in terms of how they're coping with these crises, dealing with issues of women, of education, of contributing to the larger society of which they are part, of the misunderstandings around them. And there needs to be clarity from the majority community, and that's the majority of Americans.
All right, let's talk about clarity. Extremists and militants are very quick to refer to the scriptures, the Quran, to justify their actions. That is not something that is, of course, unique to Islam. I mean, we've seen extremists and militants in other religions refer to the scriptures to justify their actions. But how big a distortion is that of the Muslim scriptures, the Quran, for instance?
Huge distortion. Very often this famous verse will be quoted that fight Christians or fight non-Muslims. And the next line of that, which says actually make peace with them because God prefers peace, will not be quoted. So very often you'll get things being taken out of context. And as you said, Anand, we can play around with the scriptures of every faith, because every faith is open to interpretation. Ultimately, faiths, all the great faiths, and I have great respect for them, all the great faiths emphasize compassion, your attitudes to your neighbor, your attitudes to humanity, to building a better, more prosperous, more peaceful life, a more peaceful society. That is what all faiths emphasize, and that is what Muslims have to focus on.
Right. Another criticism we often hear is that Muslim leaders are not vocal enough in their criticism of these terrorist actions. They don't get out there and condemn these actions. I mean, is there any validity to that claim?
I don't think there is, Anand, because I've heard this criticism all the time. I'm also being asked constantly, well, all right, you're a moderate, we accept you, you're doing great work, etc., but where are the others? Because Muslims have been, not just the last 15, 20 years, but for the last 200 years, since the first waves of colonization began in the Muslim world, constantly been answering precisely these questions. For example, the condemnation of violence. This has come right across the Muslim world from the most established institutions like Al-Azhar in Cairo. They've been consistently condemning violence everywhere. And yet I hear, why aren't Muslims condemning? I think you have to turn this question around and ask yourself, why isn't the media picking up Muslim acts of condemnation and broadcasting them? Why are they being blacked out? How often do you see Muslims on television, for example, in the debates on Islam? You'll have 4 people discussing Islam. You rarely see a Muslim. This would not happen to any other community being discussed. So these are flaws we need to redeem and correct if we want to promote better understanding in order for this situation not to continue to get out of hand.
So the message of moderation there is getting lost. Question is, how do groups like Islamic State, like Al-Qaeda, manage to hijack a religion? They're in the minority and have their say out there.
Anand, it's very simple. Acts of violence immediately escalate you into the media. It's a famous saying that 99 times the plane takes off, that's not news. Once it crashes, it's news. And that's exactly what's happening. ISIS, or in our part of the world, in South Asia, the Taliban, in Africa, Boko Haram, their violence, they're killing women, they're killing non-Muslims, they're killing Muslims. So their acts of violence are constantly in the news. But what you don't hear are the thousands and thousands of acts of kindness, of compassion, of people reaching out to each other across religions. There's so many examples we could give, but those are not heard. And I think the media bears a great responsibility here to also try to correct this very skewed image of what's going on in the world. Because if you only see this negative news, you really will have the impression that the world is on flames, and in fact, Islam is at the center of all this.
Yeah, and of course, there's also a big search for why groups like Islamic State emerge. Why are they there? What caused their creation, etc. I want to look at something that Manal Omar, she's from the United States Institute of Peace. She's the acting vice president there. She's one of the foremost voices on peace and Islam. And this is what she said, just to give you an idea of that. Oh, you know this, but it's a complicated situation. She says the complicated truth of the matter is that the extremist violence that's overtaken a majority of Muslim countries, including Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan, is the product of complex political and social circumstances. They include colonial legacies and more modern great power politics and the artificial borders that they bequeathed to the region.
She's right, Anand. It goes back, I would say, to the last century, to the colonial powers chopping up and dividing these tribes and clans into nations, and you're really bearing the fruit of that, these artificial states that were created. It's more complex because you have tribalism involved. You have the inequalities between the very rich, the corrupt elites, and the masses. You have the lack of education, health facilities, lack of any hope for the young generation. I mean, what hope do they have? Every day there's violence, their homes are being blown up, if not by their own government, then by groups like ISIS or foreign intervention. So youth is very vulnerable to acts of violence precisely because they're finding their avenues blocked. And Islam then may be able to offer something which is quick and easy and an immediate solution.
And if we look at what she says here when she talks about colonial legacies, great power politics, I mean, you mentioned the fact that, maps were drawn by colonial powers. We see that in almost a textbook case in Syria, don't we?
Absolutely textbook, Syria, Iraq, and it's more than that. Even in South Asia, for example, the famous line, the international border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is called the Durand Line. Right. Now, it was created by an officer of the British Empire in the late 19th century who just demarcated the area. Now, I've been to those areas, the tribal areas of Pakistan, and I could not find geographical features separating one country from the other. It was simply left at the whimsy of Durand. The border between East Pakistan and India in 1947 went through a railway station with the ticket office in one country and the platform in the other country. So sometimes these borders, I appreciated they were done in haste, but they were so clumsily done that they could immediately create tension between the new neighbors.
Those, of course, are going to be very hard problems to fix, without redrawing the borders of countries completely. But if we look at some of the reasons now for what is happening in the world, we take a country like Saudi Arabia, a place like Qatar, US policy for that matter, they've all been linked to bringing about Islamic fundamentalism. Would you agree with that?
Again, very complicated. There are different movements, each country promoting its own agenda, and in a sense, all colliding in this cauldron of the Middle East today. So no one is immune. You've got Saudi Arabia now being sucked in. They've just formed a new army, armies of 40 countries, mainly Muslim, mainly Sunni. You have Iran involved with its supporters. You have a very sharp Shia-Sunni conflict taking place in the Middle East. You have Russian jets flying around in Syria. You have Americans involved. You have Turks now involved. They just shot a Russian jet. So you have a world situation developing and simmering. And what appalls me is the world seems to be just mesmerized by the situation and not able to understand how dangerous this is, not just for Islam, but for the world at large.
Right, let's get back to what we talked about at the beginning, and that, of course, is Donald Trump, inflammatory racist statements that he's been making. This is incitement by any other name. Why is it getting such resonance in this country?
It is getting resonance, you rightly say. It's reflecting the opinion of a lot of his own party. All the polls confirm that large sections of the Republicans think alike. And indeed, a lot of other Americans who may not be Republicans. And that is a result, Anand, basically of the current trends after 9/11, the failure of the Muslim leadership and the failure of American leaders to bridge the gap, to close the gap that had opened up after 9/11. Now, I will say there have been heroic attempts by rabbis and bishops and imams and Muslim scholars to go out and close that bridge. But it's not been strong enough because as against that, prejudice, ignorance, hatred have continued to keep that gap wide. And into that comes Donald Trump, and he finds that he first goes for the Latin, the immigrants in the United States. He goes for other communities. He makes some derogatory remarks about the African American who was at his speech. And then he goes for the Muslims, and he finds a resonance. So he ups the ante. And you see with every statement, it gets wilder and wilder and wilder to the point when he reaches a sort of climax, a logical climax, and says, I'll ban all Muslims, full stop. Now, that has not been said or done by anyone. The fact that he pulled that off meant that either he could go over the hump and get lots of support or get a backlash. And you saw that there was a backlash not only in the United States, but abroad. I mean, from Putin in Russia to the Prime Minister of Israel to the Prime Minister of Britain, everyone was reacting in some horror because they said, how could you be saying things like this in the 21st century?
Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you, Anand.
We are going to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll talk with a Muslim activist. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.